collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up this week, the House Interior Committee has been discussing possible amendments to the law governing listed buildings, particularly after it's come to light that those bodies that should be enforcing the law as it stands are neglecting to do so.
The problem was their will to enforce the legislation. It was obvious that the competent authority, the municipality of Nicosia, didn't take any actions based on the legislation. They satisfied themselves with an agreement with the Archbishop without any fixed time frame on the repair of the buildings.
And we discuss the impact of food waste on climate change and indeed the fabric of our society. The figures are shocking.
Between a third and half of all food produced on planet Earth goes to waste.
Earlier this week, the House Interior Committee discussed preserved buildings. We do have laws about our listed buildings, but there was, if you recall, an outcry a few weeks ago when the Archbishopric bulldozed houses that were listed to make space around a new cathedral that's being built. House Interior Committee President is Eleni Mavrou. She joins us now. Eleni, I think this is something that has been, in a way, on the cards for a long time, but it does seem to me that we don't protect our architectural heritage the way we should. So what can the House Interior Committee do? Can you bring in tougher legislation? What are you discussing?
Yes, the discussion was based on the demolition of the listed buildings by the Archbishop 3 weeks ago. But the focus of the discussion was how do we strengthen legislation in order to deal with this kind of behaviors. So, on one hand, we discussed proposals in that direction, but I have to say that during the discussion, it was obvious that legislation is not enough. We do have legislation in place, even now. Perhaps it needs improvement. We need procedures that move faster and fines that are much higher. But if we take the specific incidents into consideration, the problem was not the legislation or the lack of legislation. The problem was the will to enforce the legislation. It was obvious that the competent authority, the municipality of Nicosia, didn't take any actions based on the legislation. They satisfied themselves with an agreement with the Archbishop without any fixed time frame on the repair of the buildings or any other specific measures. So even if we have a perfect legislation, people are asked to enforce it, and that's the problem. I use an example, a couple of examples I will give to make myself more clear. Hieroskiping. The law concerning the antiquities is very strict, but in that case, we saw the Council of Ministers coming and changing the character of the area, which was declared an archaeological monument, just to serve the interests of the Archbishop with his business plans. That's one thing. So the legislation is strict, is there, but it was not respected. Another example, both have to do with the Archbishop, but it doesn't mean that the problem is limited there. More than 2 years ago, the Archbishop demolished another listed building in the old part of Nicosia. 2 years later, nothing has been done in that direction. He wasn't asked to repair the building, he didn't pay any fine, the municipality didn't take the case to the court. So, yes, we will improve the legislation, but we need to exert more pressure on those responsible to enforce the legislation.
Right, you say that that's mostly the municipalities. I want to ask you about the role of the town planning department in all of this, because if you drive around town, everywhere you look, there are fabulous old buildings, some of which I believe are listed and many others are not, which are just being left to the elements, and sooner rather than later, mud brick houses, with the weather that we get these days, will just fall down. Now, why is there no concern here, apparently, for making sure that these buildings are, first of all, shored up and protected from the elements, and then some sort of law obliging owners of listed buildings to maintain them? And then let's also ask you about how you get a building listed, because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the listing has to come with the owner's approval. Now, if somebody's waiting for a building on a nice plot to fall down so that they can then build a block of flats, they're not going to do that. Don't we need an organisation, a committee, maybe the town planning department, to go around the island writing down all the buildings that deserve to be listed and doing it?
Yeah. We focus on the municipality's actions because of the specific case, but you are right that the town planning department that is responsible for listed buildings has a lot of work to do. The town planning department or the municipality have the authority to declare a building listed even without the consent of the owner, if they can document their decision based on historical or architectural information. So that can be done, and at some point in the past, this was done in a massive way. The last 2 decades, I would say that it's being done rarely. On the contrary, we have many cases of owners who come to understand the value of preserving their property, applying to the town planning department to get their building listed. Unfortunately, in this case, the procedure is very slow and it needs a lot of patience and effort on behalf of the owners. There is a subsidy for the repair of listed buildings, and that subsidy is quite considerable. It covers around 50% of the cost. But the procedure is so demanding and so slow that many owners do not benefit from this procedure. So one of the things we discussed yesterday, apart from changes in the legislation, is also how we can improve the procedure as a whole. You have the legislation on one hand, but on the other hand, you need to see incentives and procedures so that you will encourage people to benefit from having a listed building in the old part, in the old city of Nicosia, but in other areas as well. Preserving individual buildings is not enough. In most cases, we need also to focus on the improvement of the whole neighborhood. You cannot have just individual buildings here and there if the neighborhood as a whole is in bad shape. If you are going to encourage people to move back to their grandfather's property, for example, you need to improve that. And there have been initiatives in the past in that direction with the financial assistance of European funds. We need to focus more on that. I mean, many neighborhoods in Old Nicosia have been improved using these opportunities. On the contrary, the last few years, I see that, in my understanding, the municipality focuses more on the areas outside the walls, which is, it's also important, it's necessary, but the walled city cannot wait. As you said, buildings collapse every winter. It's not the first time we've seen this kind of incidents. The owners are obliged by law, if not to repair the buildings, at least to support the buildings. But if nothing is done, the repercussion for the owner is usually non-existent.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, because it's not just in the centre of the walled city of Nicosia. There are outlying areas, I live in one of them, where whole streets are indicative of the character of the place. And whole streets are going to lose rows of terraced houses that were built, 200 years ago or whatever, and they are literally falling down. So once they do fall down, I suppose the road can be widened, you can put up some glass-fronted shops or whatever, and you've lost that beautiful Cypriot character of the whole area.
The law states that if a listed building collapses or is demolished, you have to build it. You cannot build anything else. And that is, I think, one of the most important aspects of the legislation. You cannot build anything else. You have to go back to the original drawings and build the building as it's in the original drawings.
Well, that's something that's very important, but who checks that this is done? And then we're back again to the fact that the town planning department ought to be driving up and down all these old areas and checking, are these buildings listed, and if not, listing them.
Yeah. One of the things that was raised yesterday was that, okay, we have listed buildings, quite a substantial number of them, which is good. We don't safeguard them the way we should, but there are hundreds, thousands of other buildings that are equally important, that are not listed. Buildings that give the character of the neighborhood, that they come to complement the presence of the listed buildings, or buildings that are of a later era but are equally important. We have buildings of the modernist time that have not been included in the listed catalogue, and these are also part of our architectural history.
Can I just interrupt you and ask you why you think it is we're so hot on Cypriot heritage, but the one hole in our concern seems to be our architectural heritage? And what you've just said is, in fact, that we have a historical timeline starting, if you like, from the Venetian walls and coming all the way up to the present day, and it doesn't seem to be recognised by anybody.
I think that economic interest is the main reason. A listed building cannot give back to the owner as much gain, monetary gain, as a block of flats, for example. So that is one of the problems. So we need to educate people. We need to educate owners of important architectural buildings. So that is one of the things. The other thing is that the competent authorities are observers mostly as far as the protection of this heritage is concerned. They don't play an active part in listing, enabling the owners to repair them and reuse this kind of buildings. So we don't want buildings to be sitting there just empty. we need to think about reusing them, about how the owner can benefit in other, perhaps, ways rather than renting a block of flats, things like that. That's why we need to reconsider our policy as a whole. It's not just a matter of legislation.
And we also need, I suppose, to make sure that the competent authorities are indeed competent and not incompetent, which is what seems to be happening at the moment. Eleni, we have to leave it there because we've gone on much longer than I had planned. But thank you very much indeed. We're following with interest what happens particularly to those houses near the new cathedral in the old part of Nicosia, and let's see whether or not you and your fellow MPs on the Interior Committee can come up with something that will mean we don't lose any more of our architectural heritage. Thanks for joining me.
Yes, thank you.
Eleni Mavru, the chair of the House Interior Committee.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Last night, Friends of the Earth Cyprus held an online discussion entitled "It's Time to Fight Food Waste." Now, you will know, I'm sure, that in Cyprus we've been pretty bad at food waste for many, many years. People do tend to pile their plates up high and then not eat it all. Well, that's not just the food waste we're talking about. What about the role that supermarkets play and the amount of food that they throw out? The speaker at Thursday's event was Matt Homewood. He joins us now. Matt, thank you very much indeed. Now, just give us a bit of background, if you will, because you came into this in a sort of roundabout way, didn't you?
Yes, well, I moved to Denmark, one of the world's most sustainable countries from the United Kingdom, and I moved here to do a master's in climate change. And it's a broad topic, so I ended up specialising in the food system. And within that, I quickly found out that between a third and half of all food produced on planet Earth goes to waste. Of course, we consumers waste too much, and that is problematic, and we should stop wasting our money, because that's literally what we're doing. We're chucking out money out the window. But the other side of the story is the modern supermarket that has huge power within our food system. And when it comes to food waste, they generate a remarkable amount of food waste, and then they also cause food waste further up the supply chain, when they tell farmers, for example, well, we only want potatoes between 35 millimetres and 60 millimetres, and that's called food loss in kind of academic, slightly odd language. So they cause the food loss and the food waste, and I focus on the food waste because that's what I have access to. And essentially, I go around by bicycle to my local supermarkets, but they're dumpsters, so round the back this time. And I literally have a look at what they have every day, dumping out. And so I bring back some of that food back to my apartment and take photos of this food waste so that I can bring the statistics to life to really show people that this food waste actually isn't always waste at all. This is perfectly edible food that ought to have been sold at the right price. Well, if the price had been kind of right, set by the market, not by the supermarket, as I kind of explained.
There is a movement, it seems to me, pretty well across the globe, with people actually feeding themselves from supermarket dumpsters, and also with people taking on board things like home deliveries of ugly produce. Usually it's organic. What about that? Is that so small that it doesn't make much difference?
You're right. There are a number of companies, and the list is ever growing, who team up with farmers to sell this ugly fruit and vegetable that have been rejected on cosmetic standards. Yeah, those schemes are not to be sniffed at. Getting consumers to buy directly from farmers is a fantastic way to cut out the middlemen and give more of your money to farmers. So I am very much in favour of those schemes. The other movement you talk about is, I suppose, freeganism. So people who basically live off modern society's waste. And yeah, you're right, there are freegans all across this world. Now, of course, the richer the country, the more wasteful they are generally. So, for example, in Denmark, there are literally tens of thousands of people who will be dump surviving tonight, who are living completely off supermarket food waste. And that's how I started. It kind of started as a bit of a student joke, oh, let's save some money and just go dump surviving. But the issue is that I joined a lot of Facebook groups from across Western countries. I started organising my LinkedIn and Instagram pages more systematically. And I realised that there were people like me all across the Western world. And every day I was seeing their photos stream in from Sydney, from Philadelphia, from Copenhagen, from even France, where they have legislation that's supposed to be fighting this. And then I realised the seriousness of the issue because, for example, Project Drawdown, one of the world's foremost climate mitigation and research organisations in the USA, they have deemed food waste reduction the most effective solution that we have at our disposal to avoid a 2-degree climate change world. So that's why I've got a lot more organised with my work, because it started out as a joke, but it's actually become very serious.
Well, it is very serious, isn't it? Because, what is it, close to 700 million people in the world go hungry. And am I right in thinking that we do actually produce more than enough food to feed everybody? So there shouldn't be these dreadful famines you see in places if it was, well, distributed properly for a start.
That's exactly right. The UN estimated that in 2019, 690 million people went hungry. They estimated that another 1.3 billion people experienced moderate food insecurity, so not quite as bad as those 690 million people, but still people who are struggling to make ends meet. And that's the issue of these Western rich countries, and I have to say other rich countries like Japan, for example, is also wasting, because they are using a disproportionate amount of the world's resources and therefore impacting global commodity prices. And therefore, they're pricing out the people who can least afford the food. So it's actually, I came from it from an environmental angle. Turns out it's much more of a humanitarian issue. Because, yeah, we could be feeding the world. And, so the elite organisations write paper after paper about how we're going to feed the world in 2050. And in fact, if the elite really wanted to, we could feed the world tomorrow.
Let me ask you as well about our methods of production of food, because we keep hearing that because so many people are starving, we need to use GMOs and all the rest of it, and it's actually cutting down, is it not, on certainly the quality of the food, but in many cases on the actual amount of food that is available, particularly in poor countries where farmers can't use the seeds from their plants to plant next year's crops and so on. It's a huge social issue as well, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, the global food system it's a political game, essentially. You're right. We have been sold the myth, because it is a myth, that we need more and more food. And to meet that, we have to rely on kind of the fossil fuel method of farming. So high fertilizer, high pesticide, high irrigation based on these kind of improved seeds. And what's happened is that, fewer and fewer companies own those seeds, fewer and fewer companies own those inputs, and the world's farmers are reliant on more and more debt. So the world's farmers are seriously struggling. On top of that, humanity knows of 30,000 different plant species that we could be feeding from, yet we grow about 200 to meet most of our calorific needs. So we're using a monoculture system, which is, to be honest, really quite boring. Our food system could be so much more imaginative and exciting if we were allowed to rely on diversity and, proper prices for farmers. Not, how many apples can you grow for me for X amount of price? And yeah, just constant price pressure from supermarkets and big agriculture. So it's a huge game. I focus on food waste because sometimes my mind can get lost in it all a little bit. But you're right, on all angles, on all fronts, our food system is being severely pressured.
And then, of course, you've got the hedge funds that buy up stocks of certain commodities so that the price fluctuates, and buying and selling on the expense of people who can't afford to feed their families. It's really very shocking, but I wonder how many people actually look into this and understand what's going on. Have you any idea?
Well, I do think there's many people and organisations looking into it, but certainly, there's various forms of capitalism out there, but it's certainly a financial form of capitalism right now, and big finance dictates our world. So what organisations are doing to look into the commodification of our food system and our food crops, I don't know, and I don't know how much power they have to fight that, to be honest. But yeah, certainly a great cause for concern.
Right, now then you've got an Instagram account, I think it's called The Urban Harvester, is that right?
I call it an urban harvester because there's actually many of us, so I'm just one of thousands out there. But yes, it's an urban harvester.
And so people can find details and photos on there. You've also got a website, matthomewood.com, so that's easy enough. How many times do you do things like these online discussions, and what's the reaction you tend to get? Are people surprised by what you have to say?
Yeah, on Instagram, certainly people are absolutely shocked. When I post, 50 kilos of perfect meat, people just can't believe it. And it's a mix of horror and a lot of support for the cause because they understand now the epidemic we're dealing with. Last night was my first proper event like this. It's been kind of a slow ball to get going, really. I'm alone and with limited funds. So now I've got more organised, the website's up, and LinkedIn has been a great help to really boost the message because all these social media platforms rely on algorithms. LinkedIn is more favourable. Instagram just want to sell you your next bikini or whatever it might be. So that's been a great help. So I'm getting more organised and things are snowballing from here. So delighted to have done last night's event, and I'm speaking to some policymakers in Bath, UK next week, talking about how the Bath City Council can implement some ideas to fight food waste across their city. So yeah, things are moving along, but there's many actors and organisations fighting food waste as well. If people are interested, feedback.org in the UK do some amazing work. So no, I'm just grateful that more and more people are getting interested in this.
Yeah, and it is great to see so many areas of the world, and you talk about local municipalities and so on. The local authorities can play a big part, can't they? Because a lot of groups, I think, have started up with little free kitchens that actually turn the food that they get donated by supermarkets or they get from the dumpsters, as long as the health and safety people aren't going to get cross about it, and they feed people who are hungry. So that's great as well. Final question, Matt, if I may. What, if any, effect has the pandemic had on this? It seems to me more people are staying home cooking, which is something that sort of dropped off the perch in a way a few years back. Is that going to make a difference, do you think?
Yes, so I think home cooking is an important step in the right direction because it means that consumers and citizens become much more interested how to cook food and where their food is coming from. Conversely, the food waste in the supermarkets hasn't dropped at all, so that you'd have thought during a pandemic, supermarkets might have discounted a bit more to help their customers, but far from it, the dumpsters have been packed. And then the other angle is that the UN estimate that another 130 million people have been dropped into severe food insecurity on top of the 690 million. So, good and bad news there.
Yeah, indeed. Well, hopefully the Friends of the Earth Cyprus will be able to put everything that was discussed last night into practice and get the message out there. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.